What you're looking at is a network of brand new high-speed railways currently in construction across all of Africa. This will be known as the African Integrated High-Speed Rail Network and will transform Africa as we know it. This massive megaproject will feature east to west and north to south rail corridors, interconnecting major cities and connecting landlocked countries to coastal ports. This African rail system would be significantly longer than what their European neighbors to the north currently have, and resembles a broader trend of rapid African economic expansion with European economic stagnation and even in some cases, collapse.
Almost no growth in the euro area. We even had negative developments in some countries.
Well, Africa's come a long way economically over the last 10 years.
But before we get into Europe's economic decline, why exactly has Africa been experiencing rapid growth? And better yet, how would Africa, a country with relatively little infrastructure, be able to pull off such a massive megaproject? Well, this long-term project will be completed in different phases. First, there's the accelerated pilot railways, which will connect the port city of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania to the capital city of Dodoma, and then we'll go into the countries of Burundi, Rwanda, and Uganda. Additionally, in Namibia, there will be a railway constructed starting at the port city of Walvis Bay, traveling inland and connecting to the capital city of Windhoek, before entering into Botswana and then Johannesburg in South Africa. Connecting these cities and countries to each other is seen as the most important first step and has been prioritized as being part of the accelerated pilot phase. Phase 2 is the standard pilot phase, a major step up. The railways in this phase will connect many of the major African port cities to their inner capital cities and even into other landlocked countries. One of the most ambitious railways in this pilot phase is the railway connecting Alexandria on the Mediterranean to Egypt's capital city of Cairo and then extending down to Aswan before entering into Sudan and stopping at the capital city of Khartoum. Currently, very few African countries have their capitals located close to the port cities. These African capital cities have also lacked direct railways or transportation routes to their key port cities. Having strong connections between capital cities and their ports are extremely important for strengthening trade and economic development. This initial pilot project would be a massive step forward in connecting capital cities to their port cities, and if it goes well, Africa will enter into Phase 3 of their integrated high-speed rail plan. This Phase 3 is intended to be done by 2033 and will connect many of the landlocked countries in Africa to port cities in other countries. Landlocked countries in Africa are generally more poor and economically disadvantaged than Africa's coastal countries. Some of Africa's poorest countries, Chad, Niger, and Malawi, are all landlocked and rely heavily on their agriculture industry, but don't have easy access to global trade routes. These landlocked countries have to rely on Africa's coastal countries for access to oceans and the Mediterranean Sea. If these coastal countries have any kind of political instability or are facing economic challenges of their own, this directly impacts the landlocked countries' ability to access global trade routes. This Phase 3, intended to be done by 2033, is certainly ambitious, given this would include constructing 35,828 kilometers of railway. Currently, Europe has roughly 20,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, so Africa's ambitious plan for 2033 would nearly double Europe's current system. Some of these lines would also cut through Africa's hottest areas in the Sahara Desert, which are nearly impossible to live in, let alone build a high-speed rail network. One of these lines would stretch from Algiers in Algeria and travel south through the Sahara Desert before reaching the oasis in the middle of the desert known as In Salah, and then it would cross into the extremely poor Niger, before crossing into Nigeria and connecting all the way down to the booming city of Lagos. This specific example of connecting desert communities in Niger and Algeria with the booming hotspot of Lagos located on the Atlantic Ocean would be extremely beneficial for these landlocked communities. Then if we go to Phase 4 of this project, intended to be completed by 2043, this will include another 14,547 kilometers of high-speed rail. Some notable benefits to this phase will connect many of the coastal cities along Africa's rapidly growing west coast. From Alexandria all the way up in Egypt, you will be able to travel by high-speed train along the coast of Africa all the way down to the port city of Douala in Cameroon. Additionally, Cape Town, South Africa will become more accessible to other countries in southern Africa, one of the wealthiest countries in the whole continent. One of the major difficulties of constructing this massive railway system is the fact that it's on each individual country to build their own section of railway. With this in mind, how exactly do some of the less wealthy countries expect to fund this massive project? Rapidly growing countries like Nigeria and South Africa are in a much better position to fund high-speed rail networks than its landlocked neighboring countries like Niger and Chad are. If constructing this high-speed rail system is left only up to the African countries themselves, this will contribute to the landlocked countries falling even more behind, while the coastal countries will continue to get ahead and become richer. Luckily for these landlocked, less wealthy countries, they're going to have significant outside help. In fact, outside countries in Asia, Europe, and even the United States are looking to get involved in growing Africa's high-speed rail network. China is actually expected to be the biggest foreign contributor in expanding Africa's rail network, given the fact that China has already had a heavy involvement in African infrastructure projects in the past. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has already built railways in Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, and other African countries. For example, China has already helped fund the Standard Gauge Railway, which in Kenya connects the capital Nairobi with its key Indian Ocean port Mombasa. Additionally, China has funded the Ethiopia and Djibouti Railway, providing a key trade route for landlocked countries, as well as the Lagos-Ibadan Rail in Nigeria that enhances transportation around the rapidly growing country of Nigeria. But what's exactly in it for China? Why have they been assisting these countries thousands of miles away in improving their transportation systems? Well, in China's eyes, they're benefiting more from these railways than the actual African countries are. But in order to do this deep dive into communist China, I wanted to make sure that my IP address was hidden, making it harder for others to track my browsing history. I've recently looked towards downloading a VPN in order to protect my digital footprint, especially when researching more potentially controversial topics like exposing the Chinese government's financial scams. Well, that's when I discovered Surfshark, a VPN that gives me all the tools to research these shady governments, for example, while still maintaining my own privacy. My first time using Surfshark, I used their private search engine, which I found out is not only helpful for hiding my digital footprint, but I also never get an ad pop up on my computer when I have this VPN activated. You can even set your location to be in another country when you're using this VPN, which I found is very helpful for viewing blocked content. I don't know about you guys, but I often get notifications saying things like video unavailable or this video is not available in your country, but with Surfshark VPN, you can just set your location to any country you want and then get access to this blocked content. I've been such a fan of this VPN that I've partnered with them on this video, where you will all be able to secure your privacy with Surfshark and get 4 months extra at surfshark.com/uncovering. Alright, now back to communist China. China provides these African countries funding in the terms of a loan. From 2001 to 2022, the People's Republic of China has provided more than $170 billion in credits, grants, and loans to African countries. These loans were meant to fund infrastructure projects like building more railways and housing. This new money coming into Africa was exciting at first, but in recent years, many African countries have been taking a major step back on accepting these loans. For example, in 2016, the People's Republic of China lended $28.4 billion to Africa, compared to in 2020, just $2 billion. Many African countries have recently gone into trouble with debt, where already fragile economies were accepting large amounts of funding from China. These fragile economies haven't been able to pay back this debt, and interest payments on these loans have only been growing. In November of 2020, Zambia became the first country to default on its loan given by China, where they are estimated to owe Chinese lenders at least $6.6 billion. China is loaning this money to fragile economies in Africa in what is becoming known as the Chinese debt trap. Many African countries are awakening to this trap of borrowing money from foreign lenders and are now shifting their focus towards wealth that they can create independently. But with limited infrastructure in these African cities and lagging far behind other continents in terms of leading the way in the digital economy, how exactly has Africa been creating its own wealth? This independent wealth creation is starting to be done by focusing on what lies below their soil. Countries like Niger, Senegal, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo have been ramping up their exports, especially from minerals that they have a unique abundance of. Specifically for the Democratic Republic of the Congo, this country is the largest producer of cobalt globally, where 55% of all cobalt comes from the DRC. Additionally, the DRC is the second largest producer of diamonds, accounting for 21% of the globe's diamond production. The country also contains some of the highest quality copper and gold reserves in the world. The DRC has the largest gold mine in all of Africa, known as the Kibali Gold Mine. The Kibali Gold Mine has been producing 750,000 ounces of gold per year, with millions of ounces still yet to be mined. Additionally, if we move northeast, Nigeria is becoming one of the fastest growing economies in the world thanks to their abundance of oil able to be extracted. Nigeria is the largest exporter of oil in Africa and is the 9th leading exporter of oil worldwide. Much of this oil is found in Nigeria's Niger Delta region, which is a coastal area located in the southern part of the country. This region has about 78 of Nigeria's 159 oil fields. With this abundance of oil, Nigeria has been investing these profits into growing their country's infrastructure. Cities like Lagos are experiencing rapid urbanization, attracting more people from rural areas for better opportunities. Many of these opportunities revolve around the growing tech sector in Lagos, where the digital economy is now estimated to contribute $20 to $25 billion to Nigeria's GDP. This growth in the tech sector has driven a young, tech-savvy population to pursue building startup companies in Nigeria. With this rapid urbanization and a growing GDP, Nigeria is actually expected to be the third most populated country in the world by 2050. This growing economy has led to a better healthcare system, reducing child mortality rates, and allowing more Nigerian adults to reproduce. In 2022, the average Nigerian fertility rate was 5.1 births for every woman. This is dramatically higher than the global average of just 2.4 births for every woman. In fact, roughly 44% of Nigeria's population is under the age of 15. This is far higher than the United States, for example, where just 18% of the United States population is under 15 years old, and even dramatically more than Japan, where just 11% of their population is under 15 years old. In fact, this is a common trend across almost all of Africa, where the population in these African countries is growing much faster than the rest of the globe. In fact, an insane 19 out of the top 20 countries in terms of population growth are all located in Africa. Women in Africa are having many more children than what Asian and especially European women are used to having, where for example in Niger, the fertility rate is 6.6 children for every woman. In general, African countries have less access to contraception, but also have a growing healthcare system that's limiting infant mortality rates. The combination of these two factors have led to a skyrocketing population across essentially all of Africa. Africa's youthful population is very beneficial for innovation in the economy, where a young workforce can adapt quickly to new technologies and are more likely to become entrepreneurial. One of these entrepreneurial endeavors that Africa has been pursuing is the creation of smart cities. Kenya is building a new city known as the Konza City that's supposed to be Africa's new Silicon Valley. This city is intended to be a smart city and a technology hub located about 70 kilometers southeast of Nairobi, Kenya. This ambitious project is part of the Kenyan government's Vision 2030 development plan meant to transform Kenya into an industrialized, clean, and technologically advanced country. Konza City will feature Kenya's Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, a new high-speed internet, many residential homes, parks, and hospitals, and is intended to create thousands of jobs centered around the new digital economy. This city will also have a high-speed rail that will connect Nairobi and Mombasa. These are two of Kenya's largest cities and will help transport goods to the Indian Ocean. This city will also run on renewable energy sources, something that isn't very common for African cities in the 21st century. If successful, this new smart city will be the blueprint for other African nations pursuing smart city development. In fact, other African countries have already started following Kenya's lead, where Nigeria has begun constructing Echo Atlantic, South Africa has been building Lanseria City, and Rwanda Vision City, all smart cities that are adopting smart technologies and are enhancing urban infrastructure. All these smart cities and urban development wouldn't be possible without Africa's extremely high fertility rate, however. Countries outside of Africa haven't been experiencing this rapid economic growth, and a huge reason for this is their extremely low fertility rates. In some countries, these extremely low fertility rates are actually contributing to a collapsing population. In 2022, every single European country was recorded having a fertility rate below the replacement rate of 2.1 births for every woman. The European Union average fertility rate was just 1.46 births for every woman, which will gradually decline the continent's population without substantial immigration. Fewer young people entering the workforce has created a smaller working age population. This shrinking working age population has had to support the growing elderly population across all of Europe. Not to mention, programs like Social Security and the healthcare industry are starting to require more funding with Europe's aging population. Since fewer workers are contributing to funding these programs, governments in Europe are starting to face serious funding deficits. European countries have attempted to fix this low fertility problem by boosting their immigration numbers, importing people from other continents. Germany has been leading the way with its immigration numbers, where in 2023, 1,933,000 people immigrated to this country. Germany is followed by Spain with roughly 1.3 million immigrants, and then trailing behind is France and Italy at roughly 400,000 new immigrants in 2023. These immigrants are usually younger than the native population of European countries, which helps offset its aging demographics. Germany is focusing on more high-skilled workers that may contribute to their labor force, while Spain and Italy are also depending on migrants for many of their seasonal and manual labor jobs. Europe has seen a wave of asylum seekers and refugees from conflict zones like Syria, Afghanistan, and more recently, Ukraine. Countries like Germany and Sweden have introduced programs aimed at integrating asylum seekers into their labor market and have gotten mixed results. Some of these programs have been successful, but on average, many asylum seekers are still facing many challenges entering formal employment, such as accessing work permits, the language barrier, and having limited access to education. On the other hand, labor sectors in agriculture and construction have seen success with asylum workers, where there is less of an educational background required and less of a need to be literate in the language. Another major advantage that African countries have over much of Europe is their higher levels of natural resources. Most European countries aren't very energy independent, where they are forced to import oil, gas, and other natural resources from countries abroad. Before 2022, many European countries were extremely dependent on Russia for their energy. Once Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, the European Union implemented massive sanctions on Russia, essentially ending the practice of importing Russian oil. Germany went from having 36.5% of their total crude oil import levels coming from Russia in 2022 to in 2023 just 0.1% coming from Russia. Other European Union countries were also very dependent on Russia for their crude oil prior to this invasion. Following these sanctions placed on Russia, energy prices in Europe skyrocketed when one of their major suppliers was essentially eliminated. For example, in the Netherlands from 2021 to 2022, average household electricity bills rose by an astonishing 953%. The increased energy prices have also had a ripple effect on food prices and overall core inflation. The average inflation rate across Europe peaked in October of 2022, hitting a whopping 10.6%. The last time Europe saw inflation that high was around 50 years ago in the early 1970s. This energy crisis in the European Union has led many of these countries to reevaluate their dependency on other countries for natural resources like oil. The only problem is, in most of the European Union, they have no oil of their own. African countries generally have a greater abundance of natural resources compared to European countries. For example, Germany has some mineral resources like brown coal and salt, but relies heavily on imports for oil and gas. France has some uranium used for nuclear power, but depends significantly on imports for fossil fuels. Italy, Spain, and Poland all have some coal reserves, but also rely heavily on imports for most of its energy. The two European countries that do have an abundance of natural resources are Norway and Ukraine. Neither of these countries are in the European Union, however, and Ukraine's resources are currently severely impacted due to their war with Russia. Even if these European Union countries wanted to become much more independent for their energy, this would be virtually impossible given their lack of natural resources. This forces much of the European Union to have to import their natural gas and oil from countries like Norway, the United States, and now many of the booming African countries like Algeria and Nigeria. Because of this desire among many European countries to become more energy independent, many governments have started looking more towards forms of renewable energy like solar, wind, and geothermal energy. These forms of renewable energy come at a very high cost, however. Building new renewable energy facilities like wind farms, solar parks, and hydroelectric plants require a very high upfront investment. Additionally, some renewable energy sources like solar and wind aren't very consistent as they often depend on the weather conditions. Finally, large-scale renewable energy projects like wind farms and solar fields often require taking up a significant land area, which often leads to habitat destruction and changes in land usage. This can result in the displacement of many wildlife populations and can even lead to soil erosion and land degradation in many cases. Many argue that the continual adoption of renewable energy sources will be more beneficial than traditional energy sources in the long run, but for now, many of these African countries are rapidly expanding their economies by drilling for oil and mining other natural resources. Although the GDP of most European countries is still much higher than their African counterparts, the rate at which African countries' GDPs are growing is currently much higher than most of Europe. For example, 16 African countries have a GDP growth rate of 5% or higher. Compare this to Europe, just 2 European countries have a GDP growth rate of 5% or higher, Monaco and Belarus. If we lower the threshold further to a GDP growth rate of 3% or higher, 35 African countries have a 3% or higher GDP growth rate. Compare this to Europe, just 14 European countries have a 3% or higher GDP growth rate. Now you may be thinking, there's less European countries than African countries, since on this list, there's 46 total European countries and 54 African countries. Obviously, there's going to be fewer European countries that have a higher than 3% GDP growth rate than there are African countries at this level. Well, if we create simple ratios, we still find that 64% of African countries have a GDP growth rate of over 3%, while just 30% of European countries have a GDP growth rate of 3% or higher. This stark difference shows just how much faster African countries' economies are growing compared to the European countries today. Now, obviously, when analyzing a continent as a whole, there's going to be some outliers. Some European countries are growing at much faster rates than some African countries. For example, in 2022, Monaco had a GDP growth rate of a staggering 11.1%, and Sudan in 2023 had a GDP decline of 12.3%. But using these basic ratios for countries with a 3% GDP growth rate or higher, it becomes clear which continent on average is experiencing the most rapid growth. Today in 2024, many economists argue that African countries are experiencing their catch-up growth, while the European countries to the north already embody mature economies that saw their rapid growth long ago. Many African countries have the advantage of being able to bypass the older stages of industrial development and jump to the new technologies coming out today. For example, many African nations bypassed landline telephone infrastructure and jumped directly to mobile technology and mobile banking. In 2002, roughly 1 in 10 people living in Kenya owned a phone, and now today in 2024, cell phone ownership is just as common in Kenya as it is in the United States. In fact, the World Bank estimates that 650 million Africans have access to mobile phones, surpassing the number of mobile phone owners in both the United States and Europe. In some African countries, more people have access to mobile phones than they do clean drinking water, a bank account, or even electricity. Since these African economies are starting from a lower GDP per capita, even small improvements to their economies end up generating high growth rates in percentage terms. On the other hand, these European countries have much more mature economies. These countries have already undergone their industrialization and urbanization phases, and now have limited room for rapid expansion. One European country that has not only been stagnant in growth, but has actually been experiencing an economic decline is Portugal. Ever since the pandemic, Portugal has seen a rapid influx of migrants known as digital nomads coming from wealthy countries like the United States and England. These digital nomads have been sending Portugal into an economic down spiral, and you can find out exactly why that is in this video right here.